Buongiorno a tutti. I'm very pleased to introduce to you James March, who is present at our conference in Cagliari in spirit, although not in person. We are sitting now at Stanford studio at Stanford University. Good afternoon, James.
It's very good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, James. We together are really proud and honored to have the opportunity to give you this award, which is an award testifying your contribution to the birth of the field of organization studies, organization science in Italy. I don't have to cite all the books which were founding and were read by the fathers of our discipline, and so I would like you to accept this award as the first Italian award given from the organization science scholars for your outstanding contribution to the birth of the field.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. It's a great pleasure. I am honored by you and your colleagues. As you perhaps know, some of the earliest scholars of organization studies were Italian. Some of the ones that, of course, you have not read, but I've read, called Vilfredo Pareto, who was one of the earliest ones to recognize the non-rational aspects of economic behavior, and Gaetano Mosca, who was one of the earliest ones to recognize bureaucracy and the importance of skill in bureaucracy, and Benedetto Croce, who understood that art was life and life was art. These are the true founders of the field of organization studies, and they are all Italian. So thank you for allowing me to join that very distinguished crowd. And thank you also for allowing me to be virtually there, because I want to particularly to wish that distinguished Italian scholar Alfred Kieser best wishes and greetings from Stanford. I wish I were there, and I'm jealous of you. Thank you.
Jim, the title of our conference here regards the contribution which organization studies could give to the evolution, growth, and success of the economic system, in particular the Italian economic system. What do you think could be the contribution of organization studies to the innovation and growth of an economic system?
I suspect, Giuseppe, that I'm not the right person to ask that question. For many years, I began each of my courses by saying, I am not now, nor have I ever been relevant. I don't know that I really believe that, but I believe that the users of ideas should certify their usefulness, not the producers. And that those of us who are in the business of producing ideas should not attempt to advertise their usefulness. Even more generally, I think the pursuit of usefulness more often hinders than it helps fundamental scholarship. So I won't answer that question, but I hope others can.
So, what do you think would be the relationship between academic knowledge and practical knowledge, experiential knowledge?
Well, Giuseppe, I think that organizational experience is highly contextual. It depends upon a lot of variables that are specific to a specific situation. Academic knowledge is fairly general. It tries to lay out the general causal structure of relationships. So it's not very good for dealing with a specific contextual situation. I used to tell my students that if they asked an academic consultant what they should do in their work, and the academic consultant answered them, they should fire the consultant. Because the consultant simply does not have the kind of rich contextual knowledge that would permit him or her to answer a detailed question about what you should do. Experiential knowledge is much better in terms of the specific situation, but the specific situation rarely has enough information in it, so that the learning that one gets from experience is filled with superstition, with mistakes, all kinds of things of that sort. So intelligence really requires combining the two, of bringing together the academic knowledge and the experiential knowledge. And when you do that, the academic knowledge is often identifying different ways of looking at a situation, which may not be right, but are different from the way that an experienced person looks at it. And that's what we as academics have to bring to the situation.
So now, turning to questions which are more related to our academic disciplines of organizational science, how do you see the relationship between organizational science and disciplines like economics, sociology, psychology, or even political science?
Well, as you know, Giuseppe, the organization science is a rather new field. It really was born after the Second World War. It has grown enormously from an institutional point of view. The field now has its own journals. It has its own homes, mostly in business schools. It cites its own articles. It hires its own graduates. It has constructed a separate institutional field. The fields of organizational economics, organizational psychology, organizational sociology, organizational political science still exist in the separate disciplines, but they are much smaller in the fraction of the field that they represent. And they perform important functions, but it's the organization science field has become a separate institutionalized field. If you ask that question intellectually, it's a little different, however, I think. Mm-hmm. The field is primarily an importer of ideas, not an exporter. So that most of the ideas in the field really come from outside the field. They are developed and elaborated within the field, and relatively few ideas from the field of organization studies have filtered back into economics or sociology or psychology. Some extent in economics, to some extent in psychology, to some extent in sociology, and to some extent in political science. But the primary movement of ideas has been from the outside to the field. So I would say the field has become substantially independent institutionally, but much less independent intellectually.
So you were talking about the U.S. situation or the general situation?
Well, I am an American, so I probably speak more with greater information about the U.S. situation. I think the development, for example, in Europe, has been rather different, but has many elements of the same thing. The American core exhibits many of the features that were dominant in social science in the 50s and 60s. The European core exhibits many of the features that were dominant in social science in the 70s. Mm-hmm. These, I think, over time tend to merge, but they've developed in an interesting, different way.
So how should we call this field? Should we call it organizational science, organizational studies, or organizational theory?
I think that's mostly a matter of taste, personal taste. I don't think there's any profound basis for a choice. I usually prefer to talk about organizational studies rather than organizational science because I think it's a somewhat more inclusive term. It includes more people and doesn't exclude any scholars. But I'm perfectly happy when people use other terms, and occasionally I do too. The organization theory is a term that I very rarely use because if you ask me what it is, I don't know what to say. if you say, where is the theory, I don't know how to hold it out to you, in the sense of a set of assumptions and derivations that one can point to, a small set of assumptions that leads to a large number of derivations. But that's a relatively narrow definition of theory, so I'm pretty relaxed when people use the term in a somewhat looser way. But so I'm not offended by any of those uses. Personally, I'm inclined to say organizational studies, and I'm inclined not to say organization theory.
So, but what could be the unavoidable components of any theory of organization?
I'm sure I don't know the answer to that question, but the
answer was one. I had to say that we collected the questions collectively.
Yes.
So.
And now you. And will you collect the answers and send them to me? I have occasionally said there are some domains of organization studies that, or domains of ways of thinking about organizations that we sometimes think about organizations as coherent actors. That's much of economic theory of organization is of that form. We sometimes think of organizations as social structures, as relationships, as networks, things of that sort. Much of sociological studies of organizations are of that form. We sometimes think of organizations as adaptive systems, that they change over time in response to experience or whatever. And parts of all of these fields have elements of that. And we sometimes think of organizations as systems of meaning, of places in which people come to understand life and world and so on. So I can categorize the field a little bit that way, and I think somewhat usefully theoretically. But I really don't know, even within any one of those fields, a comprehensive theory that matches that part, and certainly not any theory that comes across all of those fields. That is, I don't know if you said unavoidable components, and I have no idea what that would be.
So nevertheless, could you think what could be the most powerful big ideas which could lead the field in the next years?
Well, as you know, if you ask someone what are the big ideas that are going to lead the field in the next years, they almost always give you their own ideas, their current ideas, because obviously those are the ones that are going to lead the world in the future. I think if you look at the organization studies, there are an assortment of big ideas that have been important. These are ideas that frame the way we look at things. Rationality, or the idea that individuals follow their identities and logics of appropriateness, or ideas about the class struggle, or ideas about the struggle of the self, or ideas about the distribution and utilization of power, or ideas about the development of meaning. These are all big ideas, ideas about adaptation through learning or adaptation through selection. I call these the first paragraphs of knowledge. They are where you start. And they are very useful, very important, but they very rarely get you very far by themselves. So that you can have a class warfare frame, and that's a good frame, but what you can say within that is very limited if you don't have other things. So I'm actually much more enthusiastic about what I call little ideas. And little ideas are mechanisms that we understand that have some dynamic properties to them and that have relatively big effects. And I think of things like, satisficing, for example. That's a very little idea, but a very powerful idea. It has all kinds of implications. Ideas like the low sampling of failures. This is something that Yerker Denrell and I have pursued a bit in, and it's the basic notion that in any adaptive system, you sample less your failures than your successes, so you know less about your failures and your successes. That's a very simple little idea that has all kinds of interesting implications. I think something like absorptive capacity, the idea that you have to have the capabilities to absorb new knowledge in order to use it, and the capabilities to absorb new knowledge involves various kinds of competencies. Those are all little ideas. There's certainly, you can make a long list, and that's only a very small list. That I think that's where the future of the field lies, in developing more of these little ideas. And I would guess you won't have very much change over time in the big ideas, and these little ideas fit into any number of big ideas without any trouble.
You studied organizational learning in Beth. Now our humanity is confronting very big issues like global warming, global poverty, this big economic crisis. How would you suggest humanity to address such big issues?
Giuseppe, I don't think I can be very helpful. But it's, on one hand, it's not really particularly difficult to know what to do about most of these things, about economic crisis, about global warming, about global poverty. What is difficult is to know how to do it, how to accomplish it, and how to accomplish it in a way that doesn't cause all kinds of other problems. And what you can say about all of the problems that you mentioned, I think, is they all involve a difficult trade-off between short-run and local effects and long-run and global effects. And that most of them involve you in sacrificing things in the short run and locally in order to accomplish things in the long run and globally. And neither our governmental systems nor our adaptive systems nor ourselves are very good at that. Mm-hmm. And we just are not very good at doing that. And the second thing that all these problems involve are what can be called side effects. That as you solve one problem, you create another. And we're not very good with those kinds of problems. We're not very good in two ways. One is we're not very good in anticipating the side effects. And when we anticipate the side effects, we're not very good in negotiating with the people who are harmed by the effect to make the trade-offs between those people and the people who benefit. So that until we get a governance system that is able to make those trade-offs, we will continue to know what we need to do, but not know how to do it.
Jim, you used two big literary metaphors, Don Quixote and War and Peace, and you shoot two films. They're really feature films. They're not simple expression of theoretical ideas. So, kind of art.
No.
What is, to your opinion, the contribution of art, literature to the field of academia?
Wow. The thing that got me into those films was a realization that the questions of leadership are much broader than leadership. That the questions of leadership are pretty much indistinguishable from some fundamental questions about life. The kind of things you ask are questions like, what's the relation between a public life and a private life? What's the relation between madness and genius? What's the role of power in leadership? What's the place of joy in leadership? Those are all very fundamental questions about leadership, but they're also fundamental questions about life. And once you realize that, you realize that the whole mass of intellectual and artistic performance of the human species is directed to these questions. And the questions such as what justifies great action is, I think, considered more clearly and better in great literature than it is in most social science. So you would look at Quixote and you would look at War and Peace to find answers to that kind of question. The more general issue is something about art and the role of art in life. And I mentioned Benedetto Croce earlier, the notion that life is art, or art is life, whichever way you want to put it, that one of the main points of life is to contribute as much as you can to beauty, to improve the beauty of life. I don't know whether you know the Italian film, La vita è bella.
La vita è bella.
Yeah. It's a beautiful film. And the notion that you can act to create a world. The world is ugly. It has many elements of ugliness in it, and the ugliness will not go away. In that film, Guido ends up being shot.
Yeah.
You know. But he created a world for his son that removed that ugliness, or at least ameliorated that ugliness. And I think that